Picture this. I'm sprawled on my couch, half-heartedly scrolling through Tinder, while some Netflix show I've seen twice drones on in the background. Swipe left, swipe left, swipe left, nothing worth stopping for. I'm about to give up when I see her. She has one of those perfectly imperfect smiles, like she knows a secret joke, but might share it if you're lucky. Her bio reads, Professional Pizza Enthusiast. Certified Blanket Fort Builder. It's quirky but not trying too hard. Something about her feels different. Different sounded good that night. Different sounded like exactly what I needed. Now, I'm not the type to throw out some generic hey as an opener. I spend a solid 5 minutes crafting the perfect message. It had to be clever but not too much, playful without coming off as desperate. Finally, I settle on. Do you believe in love at first swipe, or should I message you again? I hit send and immediately start overthinking it. But to my surprise, she replies, and not with some half-hearted response. She matches my energy, joke for joke, and suddenly we're talking about everything. Our mutual hatred of celery, our love of trashy reality TV, even the obscure bands we both pretended to know way too much about. I couldn't believe how easy it was to talk to her. This never happens, right? Except it was happening. That's when my inner sleuth kicked in. See, I've watched enough catfish to know better than to take someone at face value online. So like any responsible millennial, I did a little digging. It wasn't creepy. I'm not talking about hiring a private investigator or anything. But I Googled her name and tried to find her on social media. That's when I hit my first roadblock. She didn't have a Facebook. At all. I mean, who doesn't have Facebook? I casually brought it up during one of our chats, and she just laughed. Oh, I never use it, she said. Fair enough, I thought. Some people are off the grid. But something about it didn't sit right. I asked for her last name, just to see if it would lead anywhere. And that's when suddenly she did have a Facebook. The profile was sketchy as hell. No posts older than a week, only 5 photos total, and all of them looked like stock images of a girl living her best life. Her name sounded straight out of a spy movie. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a scam. But then she sent me this goofy meme about pizza toppings, and my brain went, she can't be that bad, right? I convinced myself to let it go. She was probably just weird, and weird wasn't necessarily bad. So when she suggested meeting up, I agreed. She picked a bar halfway between where she said she lived and where I lived. It seemed like a reasonable choice, public, busy, and neutral ground. But as I was driving there, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I was walking into a setup. My overactive imagination painted a vivid picture. I'd walk in, and instead of meeting her, I'd get jumped by some sketchy group of Russian dudes she was working with. Just to be safe, I stopped at an ATM on the way and deposited all my cash. It felt a little paranoid, but I wasn't about to take chances. When I got to the bar, there she was. She looked just like her profile pictures, and for a second, all my doubts melted away. She smiled, waved, and even gave me a quick hug. Everything seemed fine, until she said, "This place is a little crowded. Let's go somewhere else." It felt like a trap. Who changes locations on a first date? But she was already heading for the door, and I didn't want to seem rude. As we walked to the next bar, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting a gang of thugs to jump out of the shadows. Nothing happened. We made it to the second bar, got a couple of drinks, and sat down to talk. At first, I was still on edge. Every part of me screamed, be suspicious. But as the conversation flowed, I started to relax. She was funny, sharp, and just the right amount of weird. We talked for hours, about everything from travel plans to our favorite childhood cartoons. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd misjudged her. And then she brought up pizza. "There's this amazing pizza place across the street," she said. Her eyes lit up as she described it, and I couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. By then I was a little tipsy, so when she suggested going, I agreed. But as we were leaving the bar, she suddenly stopped and said, "Actually, let's go somewhere else. There's an even better pizza place, like 15 blocks away." 15 blocks. It was freezing outside, and I wasn't exactly dressed for a hike. But she had this infectious energy, like this pizza place was going to change my life. Against my better judgment, I followed her. By the time we got there, I couldn't feel my fingers or toes, and I was starting to wonder if she was messing with me. The pizza? It was fine. Not life-changing. Not even great. Just pizza. I didn't say anything, though, because she seemed genuinely happy about it. After we ate, she suggested hitting one more bar. I should have said no. I should have gone home. But for some reason, I said yes. At the third bar, the conversation took a deeper turn. She told me she'd just gotten out of a 4-year relationship, like days before we matched on Tinder. I could tell it was still fresh for her, and while part of me wanted to run, another part wanted to stay. She was messy, sure, but there was something about her I couldn't walk away from. At one point, she leaned in and kissed me. My brain immediately started panicking. This was way too fast, wasn't it? I barely knew her, and the night had been a roller coaster of suspicion and surprise. But something about the way she smiled at me afterward made me think, maybe this is worth it. When the night ended, I was sure I'd never hear from her again. It felt too weird, too chaotic. But the next morning, she texted me, "Last night was fun. Let's do it again sometime." That was a year ago. She wasn't a spy or a scammer, just a delightfully weird person who didn't care about following anyone's rules but her own. Since then, we've been inseparable. Every now and then, I bring up all the red flags I had to ignore to keep dating her, and she just laughs. "You didn't have to follow me to that second pizza place," she teases. But honestly, I'd follow her anywhere, even if it's 15 blocks in the freezing cold for mediocre pizza. Let me set the scene. I'm a stressed out, overworked college student in need of some kind of social distraction when Tinder first came onto the scene. Back then, it wasn't the meme-laden wasteland it's sometimes known for now. It felt shiny, new, and promising. You'd swipe, match, and maybe, just maybe, you'd hit the jackpot and meet someone who didn't start every sentence with WID. That's exactly what happened when I matched with her. Let's call her Bae. She was a paramedic, and her bio was like a magnet for my attention. Sharp, funny, and so real it practically screamed this is not a drill. For once, I wasn't nervous about opening the conversation. She seemed cool, and I threw out something playful. To my surprise, she responded right away. From there, the messages flew back and forth. I was quick-witted and hilarious, the kind of person who could turn any mundane story into a full-blown comedy special. We bonded over everything, the absurdity of our schedules, her paramedic shifts, my school and work chaos, the misery of waking up before the sun, and our shared appreciation for memes so bad they looped back around to being genius. Over the days we chatted, I found myself actually looking forward to hearing that little notification ding on my phone. This felt different. She had a thing, though. Playfully, but also a little too often, she'd ask, "You're not sketchy, are you? You don't have a rap sheet or some weird secret life?" It was clearly a joke, but there was a thread of truth in it. She admitted she had a bit of a type, and unfortunately for her, that type often included guys with bad habits and worse judgment. I laughed it off and reassured her that no, I was not a closet criminal, just a caffeine-fueled student trying to make it through the week without imploding. We'd been chatting for almost a week when we set a date to finally meet up. It wasn't going to be anything wild, just a chill coffee hang after one of her shifts. I was psyched. There was just one more weekend shift to get through, and then I'd meet the girl who had somehow made Tinder feel like something more than a swipe factory. 2 nights before the big meetup, though, fate decided to mess with me in the worst way imaginable. I was walking to a buddy's house for a low-key beer and hangout night when 2 guys jumped me out of nowhere. I didn't even see them coming. One second I was texting my friend to say I was almost there. The next, I was being shoved against a wall, fists grabbing at my jacket and neck. The gold chain I wore, the only bit of jewelry I owned, and one I probably should have left at home, caught their attention immediately. I wasn't about to hand it over without a fight. Bad decision? Absolutely. They didn't just want the chain, they wanted my rings too. I lashed out, struggling against them, adrenaline doing its best to keep me upright. Somewhere in the chaos, one of them pulled a knife. I didn't feel the stab at first. I just felt the force of the blow to the back of my head, like someone had hit me with a metal pipe. It wasn't until I stumbled back and touched my neck that I felt the blood. A lot of blood. Oh, and as if the situation couldn't get any worse, the small bag of weed in my jacket pocket spilled out during the scuffle. I hadn't even remembered it was there. So there I was, sitting on the sidewalk, bleeding out of a gash in my skull, surrounded by my own spilled stash and the lingering echo of my attacker's retreating footsteps. I was still sitting there in a haze of shock, blood dripping down my neck and pooling around me, when I heard the sirens. Somebody had called for an ambulance, which, great, because I wasn't in the mood to bleed out on the street that night. My vision was blurry, and my head throbbed like I'd been hit with a sledgehammer. All I wanted was to get patched up, go home, and bury myself under a mountain of blankets. The ambulance pulled up, and the doors swung open. That's when I saw her. It was out of all the ambulances in a city of 3 million people, of course it had to be hers. I blinked, trying to process what was happening, but there was no mistaking her. She froze for a split second, staring at me like she couldn't believe it either. Then, like a pro, she snapped into paramedic mode and got to work. "Hey," she said, her voice sharp but professional. "You're bleeding pretty bad. Let's get you on the stretcher." All I could think was, oh my God, I'm bleeding out, and this is the most embarrassing moment of my life. I mean, what were the odds? What kind of sick cosmic joke was this? The girl I'd been texting for a week, who thought it was hilarious to ask if I was sketchy or had a criminal past, was now face to face with me in the most suspicious-looking situation imaginable. I tried to explain as they loaded me into the ambulance, but honestly, there wasn't much I could say. The blood, the knife wound, the scattered weed on the ground. It didn't exactly scream innocent victim. To her credit, she stayed professional the whole ride, but I could feel the awkward tension radiating off of her. We recognized each other immediately, but she didn't acknowledge it beyond a tight-lipped, barely there nod. The ride felt like an eternity. She patched me up as best she could, her movements precise and practiced, but I could feel the judgment. Or maybe I was projecting. Either way, the humiliation was unbearable. I made it to the hospital, got a few stitches, and was sent on my way. By the time I got home, the adrenaline had worn off, replaced by a sickening realization. I was probably never going to hear from her again. Not after that. I sent her a text anyway, something short and light. Well, that was the most awkward first meeting in history. "Sorry you had to deal with that." She didn't respond. Not that night, not the next day, not ever. She unmatched me on Tinder, too. It wasn't hard to figure out why. To her, I probably looked like exactly the kind of guy she was trying to avoid, a walking, bleeding embodiment of her worst dating instincts. Now I can laugh about it. At the time, though, it was brutal. I'd gone from riding the high of matching with someone genuinely cool to crashing into the absolute worst first impression imaginable. The irony still kills me. Out of all the ambulances in the city, it had to be hers. Out of all the things I could have been doing, I had to be sitting there looking like the poster boy for bad life choices. I can't blame her for ghosting me. I mean, what would you do if you rolled up to a scene and saw a guy you were planning to date sitting on the sidewalk, bleeding from a knife wound, with weed scattered around him? Exactly. Now, whenever I tell this story, it always gets a laugh. It's ridiculous, right? The kind of thing that sounds too absurd to be real. But it happened, and I've got the scar to prove it. If nothing else, it taught me to keep my gold chain at home, and maybe rethink carrying weed in my pocket when I'm out for a walk. And hey, at least I never have to answer the question, "What's your worst first impression story?" again. This one's got it locked down. It started the way these things always do, with a swipe. His profile caught my eye right away, not because of some chiseled jawline or overly curated travel pics, but because he had a bio that actually made me laugh. Something about being a part-time connoisseur of gas station snacks and a full-time breaker of awkward silences. It wasn't just that it was funny, it had personality. So I swiped right, not really expecting anything to come of it. But then, almost immediately, we matched. The first message he sent was just as clever as his bio. I don't remember the exact words, but it had me grinning at my phone like an idiot. You know when someone's just so effortlessly funny and sharp that the conversation flows like you've known each other for ages? That's what it felt like with him. We texted back and forth nonstop for days, trading jokes, sharing random facts, and even diving into some pretty deep conversations about life. He had this wit that made me feel like I was constantly trying to keep up, and I loved it. It was rare to click with someone so quickly, and I couldn't help but think, wow, maybe this could actually go somewhere. By the time we decided to meet up, I was genuinely excited. Not nervous, not skeptical, just excited. I'd built up this image of him in my head based on our texts, and while I tried to remind myself to keep my expectations realistic, it was hard not to hope for the best. He picked a coffee shop downtown that was cozy and casual, the kind of place where first dates feel low pressure and easy. I remember walking in and scanning the room, spotting him at a table by the window. He waved, smiling, and I made my way over. Here's the thing. When I first saw him in person, I knew immediately that I wasn't physically attracted to him. It's not like he was unattractive, he just wasn't my type. I felt a pang of disappointment, but I tried to shake it off. After all, looks weren't everything, right? Besides, I already knew he was smart and funny, and I figured that could make up for a lot. So I sat down, smiled, and decided to give it a chance. At first, things were fine. The conversation was easy, just like it had been over text, and I started to relax a little. He told me a hilarious story about a disastrous camping trip he'd been on, complete with a run-in with a raccoon that stole his sandwich, and I found myself laughing despite the initial awkwardness. He had this way of pulling you into his world with his words, making even the most mundane experiences sound like adventures. For a while, I forgot about my reservations and just enjoyed the moment. But then things took a turn. It started when he leaned back in his chair, glanced around as if to make sure no one was listening, and said, "Okay, I wasn't planning on bringing this up tonight, but I feel like I can trust you." Immediately, my curiosity was piqued. Was he about to tell me some wild family secret? Confess to a double life as a spy? My mind was racing with possibilities, but nothing could have prepared me for what he said next. "I've been abducted by aliens." I blinked, sure I must have misheard him. "Wait, what?" I said, half laughing, waiting for him to admit it was a joke. But he didn't laugh. He just looked at me, completely serious, and said, "Yeah, it's happened a few times, actually. Since I was a kid. There are moments in life where you feel like you've stepped into a completely different reality, like the ground beneath you has shifted, and you're suddenly in uncharted territory. This was one of those moments. My brain couldn't decide how to react. On the one hand, this was absolutely insane. On the other hand, I was kind of fascinated. "I know it sounds crazy," he said quickly, as if trying to preempt whatever reaction I might have. "And I get it if you think I'm nuts. Most people do. That's why I usually don't talk about it, especially not on first dates. But you seemed, I don't know, open-minded." I nodded slowly, trying to process what he was telling me. I'd always been interested in UFOs and alien abductions, not in a wear a tinfoil hat kind of way, but more in a this stuff is so weird and intriguing kind of way. So instead of running for the hills, I leaned in and said, "Okay, tell me more." His eyes lit up, like he couldn't believe I was still sitting there. He launched into the story of his first abduction, which he claimed happened when he was 8 years old. He described waking up in the middle of the night to a bright light shining through his bedroom window and a strange, humming noise that seemed to vibrate through his entire body. The next thing he remembered, he was lying in a field miles away from his house with no idea how he'd gotten there. As he spoke, he rolled up his sleeve and pointed to a spot on his arm. "This is where they implanted the device," he said, his tone completely matter-of-fact. I leaned closer and saw a small, circular scar, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. "I've had MRIs and everything," he added. "Doctors can't explain it, but I know it's there." Part of me wanted to laugh. This was objectively absurd, right? But another part of me was completely captivated. He was so earnest, so convinced of his own story, that I couldn't bring myself to dismiss him outright. Besides, I'd read enough about alien abduction accounts to know that he wasn't alone in his experiences. People all over the world had reported similar things, and while I wasn't sure how much of it I believed, it was fascinating to hear about it firsthand. We spent the rest of the date talking about his abduction experiences, from the bizarre, dreamlike memories he had of being on a spacecraft to the times he'd woken up with unexplained marks on his body. He admitted that he felt stupid for bringing it up, especially on a first date, but he said it was something that had shaped his entire life, and he couldn't hide it forever. "Better to find out now if it's a deal breaker," he said with a shrug. When the date ended, I thanked him for sharing his story. And I meant it. Whatever else I felt about the situation, it had been one of the most interesting conversations I'd ever had. But as I walked home, I knew deep down that we wouldn't be seeing each other again. It wasn't just the alien thing, though that was definitely part of it. It was that I didn't feel the kind of spark I was looking for, the kind of connection that could make me want to dive headfirst into someone else's world, no matter how strange it was. I texted him later to thank him again and wish him the best, but I never heard back. Maybe he realized I wasn't as open-minded as he'd hoped, or maybe he just decided to move on. Either way, I still think about him sometimes. I wonder if he's found someone who believes him, someone who's as fascinated by his stories as he is. She called herself a classy lady in her bio, which normally might have sounded a little too self-congratulatory, but somehow it worked. Her photos were stunning, long dark hair, a smile that could probably get her out of any speeding ticket, and this vibe that screamed confidence. I swiped right, figuring there was no way she'd match with me, but hey, worth a shot. And then boom. It's a match. I remember just staring at the screen for a second, my brain doing that stupid thing where it's like, wait, me? Really? I opened with something casual, something that wasn't totally lame. Probably a compliment about her style or her bio. I can't remember exactly. What I do remember is that she replied almost instantly. That's when I knew I had a shot. The conversation was electric. She was quick, funny, and just the right amount of flirty. You know when someone gives you butterflies, and you're just praying you don't screw it up? That's how it felt. We talked about everything and nothing all at once. Movies, food, travel dreams, margaritas. She mentioned margaritas like 3 times. So naturally, I suggested a meetup at this little Mexican place near my apartment that had killer drinks. She agreed, and just like that, we had a date set. I showed up early, which is saying a lot because I'm notoriously bad at being on time. The place was buzzing, full of laughter and the smell of fresh tortillas. I found a table near the bar and kept nervously checking my phone to see if she'd text that she was running late, or worse, that she wasn't coming. But then she walked in, and let me tell you, she was even better in person. I'm talking jaw-dropping. She was exactly who she said she was, which, on Tinder, is like hitting the lottery. She saw me, smiled, and made her way over. "Hey," she said, her voice smooth and warm. "Glad you found the place." We ordered margaritas, and the conversation flowed as easily as the drinks. I couldn't believe how well it was going. She was charming, funny, and had this magnetic energy that pulled me in every time she laughed. Every now and then, she'd touch my arm when she made a point, and I'd feel my heart rate spike like I was in gym class all over again. She was a total knockout, and the way she looked at me made me feel like the only guy in the room. By the time we were on our 3rd margaritas, the tension was palpable. You know that moment when you both know exactly where things are headed, but neither of you says it out loud? That was us. At some point, she leaned in and said, "So your place isn't far, right?" I almost choked on my drink. Yeah, like 5 minutes," I stammered, trying to play it cool while internally fist-pumping. We paid the bill. Well, I paid the bill because apparently I turn into some kind of chivalrous knight when margaritas and stunning women are involved, and headed out. The walk back to my apartment was a blur. She was holding onto my arm, laughing at something stupid I said, and I was just praying I didn't trip and faceplant in front of her. By the time we got inside, it was game over. She kissed me the second the door shut, and let's just say it escalated quickly. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, we were on my couch, clothes everywhere, her nails digging into my back in the kind of way that makes you question all the bad dates you've suffered through just to get to this moment. When it was over, we were lying there on the couch, breathless, when she turned to me with this satisfied smile and said, "That was amazing. I really hope we can do that again." I was about to say something equally cheesy, something like, "Yeah, anytime," because I was riding the high of thinking this might turn into something real. But then she dropped the bomb. "Oh, and by the way," she added casually like she was commenting on the weather, "I'll contact you." No need to contact me. I don't want my husband to find out. My brain short-circuited. "Wait, what?" I said, sitting up so fast I nearly fell off the couch. "Husband?" She just shrugged, completely unfazed. "Yeah, don't worry. It's not a big deal. He travels a lot for work, so this is just, fun." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This gorgeous, funny, magnetic woman, who I'd been convinced was some kind of Tinder miracle, was married? And not just married, but apparently so chill about cheating that she thought it was worth a casual mention after we'd already hooked up? I didn't even know what to say. My brain was screaming a mix of, how did I miss this? And you've got to get her out of here. She must have picked up on my deer-in-the-headlights expression, because she laughed and patted my leg like we were old pals. "Relax," she said. "It's not like he's ever going to find out. I've got it under control." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just kind of nodded, still in shock. She got dressed, kissed me on the cheek like nothing had happened, and said, "I'll text you in a couple of weeks." And then she was gone. For 2 weeks, I couldn't stop replaying the night in my head. I felt like an idiot for not realizing something was off. Like, how had I missed the signs? Was I that blinded by her looks and charm? Part of me felt guilty, even though I hadn't known she was married going into it. The other part of me was just straight up confused. Who does that? Who drops a bombshell like that so casually? True to her word, she texted me exactly 2 weeks later. It was short and to the point. "Hey, hope you're doing well. I'm free this weekend if you want to hang out." I stared at the message for a solid 10 minutes before deciding I wasn't about to get involved in whatever messy situation she had going on. I didn't reply. She didn't follow up, and I never heard from her again. I deleted Tinder after that. Not because I think everyone on there is like her. I know there are plenty of normal, decent people out there, but because I needed a break from the roller coaster of dating. The whole experience left me questioning a lot of things, like how much you can really know about someone you meet online, and whether I was ready to deal with whatever came next. I sometimes think I got out of the dating game too soon, just before Tinder truly took over and turned dating into a sport. But honestly, if it was anything like my OkCupid days, maybe I dodged a bullet. Back then, I thought OkCupid was the pinnacle of modern romance, filled with clever profiles, interesting prompts, and allegedly real people. Turns out, it was mostly a hotbed of bizarre characters who thought a halfway decent pun in their bio was enough to hide their overwhelming weirdness. I kept a blog back then, partly for the catharsis, and partly because, well, if I was going to wade through the swamp of online dating, I might as well get some good stories out of it. And oh boy, did I ever. I've had my fair share of weird conversations, but one guy stands out like a flaming neon sign in the middle of a blackout. He's the reason I learned to be careful about what you wish for when you say, "This could make a great story." It started innocently enough, or at least as innocently as it ever does on a site where people are actively hunting for hookups disguised as connections. His profile wasn't extraordinary. He was a little quirky, the kind of guy who tried to position himself as a misunderstood intellectual, tossing around words like zeitgeist and existential without any apparent context. But he had a certain charm in his messages, a quick wit that convinced me to keep the conversation going. It didn't hurt that I was bored out of my mind that week, and boredom is dangerous when you're dabbling in online dating. The first red flag, and there were many, came about 15 minutes into the conversation. Out of nowhere, he asked, "So, do you promise you'll have sex with me when we meet?" Like full stop. No lead up, no context. Just casually throwing it out there, as though I'd be thrilled to pinky swear on my future consent before we'd even exchanged last names. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to figure out if this was some kind of bizarre joke. When I finally replied, it was with a cautious but firm, "No, I don't really make that decision before meeting someone in person." I thought that was a reasonable boundary to set, but apparently it wasn't. He immediately launched into what I can only describe as a manifesto. According to him, meeting up with someone and then deciding whether to have sex was a colossal waste of time. His words, not mine. At this point, I probably should have just stopped replying, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see how far this rabbit hole went. It felt like watching a train wreck in slow motion. I couldn't look away. I told him that I wasn't comfortable committing to something so personal with a virtual stranger, which seemed like a pretty standard boundary. His response? A long-winded rant about how women are too picky and how the modern dating scene was a conspiracy against good men. Apparently, the world was out to get him because he dared to be honest about his intentions. I could practically hear the violin music playing in the background as he painted himself as the tragic hero of his own story. I was half annoyed, half entertained, and maybe just a little fascinated by his audacity. I kept responding, not because I was remotely interested, but because every reply I got from him felt like opening a particularly unhinged fortune cookie. I never knew what level of absurdity I was about to uncover. Then came the kicker. He suggested we meet up. Now, I'll admit, part of me considered it, if only for the story. By this point, I was fully aware that he was a walking red flag parade, but there's a certain allure to chaos when you know you're safe behind a screen. I thought, imagine the blog post I could write about this guy. But then he dropped the bombshell. "By the way," he said, "you'd have to pick me up. I don't have a car. I'm not someone who judges people for their transportation situation. Life happens." But I was curious, so I asked, "Oh, why don't you drive?" His answer was the kind of thing that makes you question whether you're in a hidden camera show. "With all the seriousness in the world," he said, "because driving is a useless gesture." A useless gesture. I sat there, reading and rereading his message, trying to make sense of it. He went on to explain in great detail how society's dependence on cars was part of a larger existential failing. Driving, he said, was not only pointless, but a symbol of humanity's misguided priorities. It was the kind of answer that sounded like it was ripped straight from the pages of a failed freshman philosophy essay. But what really got me was his complete lack of awareness about how this came across. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't joking. He truly believed that refusing to drive made him some kind of enlightened rebel, even as he was sitting there asking me to chauffeur him around like his personal Uber. At that point, any lingering thoughts I had about meeting him evaporated. There's a fine line between chasing a good story and willingly stepping into chaos, and he was way over that line. I told him, as politely as I could, that it didn't seem like we were a good match and wished him well. He He didn't take it well. His parting message was a rant for the ages, a diatribe about how I was just like all the others who didn't understand his brilliance. He accused me of being shallow and close-minded, and then, just to drive the point home, he blocked me. I wasn't even mad. If anything, I was relieved. It was like having a very loud, very opinionated storm pass through your neighborhood and finally move on. I never did meet him, but honestly, the experience was more than enough. Every now and then, I wonder where he is now. Maybe he's still on OkCupid, railing against the injustices of modern dating. Maybe he's out there, wandering the streets on foot, living his truth as a protest against the tyranny of the automobile. Whatever he's doing, I hope he's happy. And I hope he's learned that calling driving a useless gesture isn't exactly the fast lane to anyone's heart or their passenger seat. I still can't believe this happened to me. Honestly, when people tell their Tinder horror stories, I usually think, wow, I got lucky. My experiences weren't that bad until this one. It started like most Tinder stories, mindless swiping while procrastinating on schoolwork I should have been doing. I wasn't even looking for anything serious at the time. Just a distraction, a bit of fun, maybe even a halfway decent date. Then I matched with him. Let's call him Alex. His profile wasn't anything groundbreaking, but there was this effortless charm to it. He wasn't trying too hard with over-filtered photos or corny bios. Just a cute smile, a solid sense of humor, and a love for spontaneous road trips. His opening message was something funny and memorable. Something about how I looked like I'd destroy him at trivia. I liked that. Not just the trivia thing, but that he seemed confident and funny without being one of those guys who tries to neg you into liking them. We hit it off right away. Over the next couple of days, we texted back and forth nonstop. It wasn't just the usual surface-level stuff, either. Sure, we joked about bad Tinder dates and weird niche TV shows we both loved, but we also talked about deeper things. What we wanted out of life, the places we wanted to visit, and even random childhood memories. He was easy to talk to, and honestly, I was kind of excited to meet him in person. That didn't happen often for me with Tinder matches. Our first date was good, like really good. He suggested a little indie coffee shop downtown, and when I walked in, he was already there, sitting at a table with 2 cappuccinos. He'd remembered from our texts that I liked cappuccinos. That earned him points right away. He stood up, gave me this warm smile, and said, "Hey, I'm glad you came." The date was a mix of laughter and ease. He was just as funny in person as he was over text, and there was this natural chemistry between us that felt rare. By the end of the date, when he walked me to my car, there was this moment where we both paused, and then he kissed me. It was sweet, nothing over the top, but enough to leave me smiling all the way home. We kept seeing each other. It wasn't every day. Our schedules didn't line up perfectly, but we made it work. The second date was a movie night at his place, where we spent more time talking and laughing than actually watching the movie. The third was dinner at a little hole-in-the-wall Italian spot that he swore had the best lasagna in town. He was right, by the way. Each time we saw each other, things felt more comfortable, more natural. It was like we were building something without even trying. By the 4th or 5th date, we were in full flirtation mode. There were stolen glances, playful touches, and an energy between us that was getting harder to ignore. So when he invited me over one night to hang out, I knew what that really meant. And I was ready for it. We were on his couch, the mood perfectly set, dim lights, music playing softly in the background. At first, we were just talking, but the space between us kept shrinking until there was no space left at all. When he kissed me, it was like all that built-up tension finally snapped. Things got heated quickly, and for the first time, it felt like we were crossing from "this is fun" to "this is serious." And then, everything came crashing down. We were in the middle of making out, like really into it, when he suddenly pulled away. At first, I thought I'd done something wrong. He was sitting there, breathing heavily, not looking at me. "Alex?" I said, feeling my heart drop a little. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he put his hands over his face and started shaking his head. And then, to my absolute shock, he started crying. Not like a single tear rolling down his cheek. I'm talking full on, can't catch his breath sobbing. I froze, completely unsure of what to do. I mean, what do you do in that situation? 1 minute, we're making out, and the next, he's having a breakdown in my lap. "Hey," I said softly, reaching out to touch his shoulder. "It's okay. What's going on?" He looked up at me, his eyes red and puffy, and blurted out, "I think I might be gay." It took me a second to process what he'd just said. "Oh, I said, probably not as eloquently as I should have. My brain was scrambling to catch up. Okay, do you want to talk about it? He nodded, tears still streaming down his face. And then for the next hour, he poured his heart out to me. He told me about how he'd been questioning his sexuality for a long time, but had been too afraid to admit it to himself, let alone anyone else. How he'd dated girls before and liked them, but never quite felt the kind of attraction he thought he was supposed to feel. How he'd gone on Tinder because he thought maybe if he found the right girl, it would all click into place. And then I met you, he said, his voice breaking. And you're amazing. You're smart and funny and beautiful, and I thought maybe it was finally happening. But now I just feel like I'm lying to you, and to myself. I didn't know what to say. My heart broke for him, not because he wasn't into me the way I'd hoped, but because he was clearly going through something huge and painful, and he didn't know how to handle it. I wanted to be mad, to feel rejected, but all I felt was empathy. Alex, I said, it's okay. You're allowed to figure this out. You don't have to have all the answers right now. He nodded, sniffling, and gave me this look that was half grateful, half embarrassed. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean for this to happen. I really like you, but I think I need to figure out who I am before I can be with anyone. I told him I understood, and I meant it. He walked me to the door that night, and we hugged for a long time. It was one of those hugs that feels like a goodbye, even though no one says it out loud. And then I left. I didn't hear from him after that. Part of me wanted to reach out, to check on him and see how he was doing, but I didn't want to make things harder for him. I figured he needed space to sort through everything, and I respected that. I liked the thrill of swiping, the potential for a good story, and maybe, just maybe, the hope of finding someone who wasn't a total disaster. It's like fishing in a murky pond. Sometimes you pull out a boot, and sometimes you get a fish. But this guy, he felt like the catch of the day. Let's call him Jake. Jake had that golden combination of good looks, charm, and a bio that made me laugh out loud. Something about his love for midnight tacos and terrible reality TV spoke to my soul. His opening line wasn't one of those generic hey messages either. He'd clearly read my profile and made a witty comment about the book I'd mentioned. I was impressed, so much so that I actually smiled at my phone like an idiot, alone in my room. From there, we started chatting nonstop. Jake had this way of making you feel like the only person in the room, even over text. He was sweet, funny, and had this slightly self-deprecating humor that I found irresistible. We talked about everything, our favorite late-night snacks, our college horror stories, and even those dumb little hypothetical questions like, would you rather fight 100 duck-sized horses or one horse-sized duck? For the record, he was 100 duck-sized horses kind of guy. After about 2 weeks, I was pretty smitten. It wasn't just his charm, it was the way he seemed genuinely interested in me. He remembered small details I'd mentioned in passing and brought them up later, which is basically Tinder gold. When he finally asked me out, I didn't hesitate to say yes. It felt like one of those rare times when the online connection actually translated into something real. But before we even made it to that first date, the cracks started to show. It started with a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail, figuring it was probably spam, but when I listened to the message, my stomach dropped. It was a woman's voice, angry and accusatory, asking why I was talking to her boyfriend. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Jake didn't seem like the type to have a girlfriend lurking in the background, especially not one who'd go to the trouble of tracking down his Tinder matches. Still, I couldn't shake the unease the message left me with. When I confronted Jake about it, he laughed it off. He told me the woman was his roommate, let's call her Sarah, and that she was completely nuts. According to him, Sarah was in love with him, despite him having zero interest in her, and she'd been making his life miserable ever since he'd turned her down. He even claimed she'd tried to get him fired from one of his jobs out of spite. She's just obsessed, he said, shaking his head like it was the most exhausting thing in the world. I'm so sorry she's dragging you into this. I wanted to believe him. He seemed so genuine, so frustrated by the whole situation. And who hasn't dealt with a crazy roommate, right? So I let it slide. I blocked the number, reassured him that I wasn't going to let her scare me off, and agreed to meet him for our date later that week. The date itself was great. Jake was just as sweet and charming in person as he was over text. We grabbed coffee, wandered around a park, and talked about everything under the sun. By the time he walked me to my car, I was already thinking about our next date. He kissed me goodbye, and I drove home feeling giddy, like maybe I'd finally found someone worth my time. But then Sarah called again. This time, she wasn't just angry, she was desperate. "Please," she said, her voice shaking. "Please stop seeing him. He's not who you think he is." I tried to tell her that I didn't want to get involved in their drama, but she wouldn't let it go. She started telling me things that made my head spin. How she and Jake had moved to the city together from another state, how they were living together, and how she wasn't just his roommate, she was his girlfriend. I didn't want to believe her. It felt like this twisted reality TV plot that I'd accidentally stumbled into, and I didn't know who to trust. Jake had seemed so honest, so transparent about everything. But Sarah's details were too specific to ignore. She knew things about him, things he'd told me himself, but from a completely different perspective. When I confronted Jake about it, he didn't deny it right away. Instead, he tried to spin the story, saying that Sarah was technically his girlfriend, but only because he needed a way to stay in the country. That's when it all came tumbling out. Jake wasn't a citizen. He'd moved here on a visa that had expired, and he and Sarah had started dating as a way to keep him from being deported. "It's not real," he insisted. "I don't love her. I'm just stuck." I didn't even know what to say. Part of me felt bad for him. He was clearly in a tough spot, but the rest of me was furious. He'd lied to me, dragged me into this mess, and made me doubt myself and my instincts. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I didn't think you'd give me a chance," he said, like that made it okay. Like his lies were somehow justified because he thought I wouldn't understand. I walked away that day and never looked back. He tried to call me a few times after that, but I ignored him. Sarah stopped calling too, which was a relief, though I couldn't help but feel for her. She'd been lied to just as much as I had, maybe even more. Looking back, the whole experience feels surreal, like something out of a bad rom-com. I'd gone into it thinking I'd found this sweet, genuine guy, and instead, I'd stumbled into a web of lies, fake relationships, and immigration drama. It's almost impressive how messy it got in such a short amount of time. It started like any other lazy Friday night, me, my sweatpants, a bag of chips, and my phone. I was deep into my usual Tinder swipe session, half paying attention while Netflix droned on in the background. Left, until suddenly there he was. A solid 10. We're talking magazine cover level of handsome. Perfect smile, jawline for days, and eyes that looked like they could see into your soul. You know the kind of guy you swipe right on, just for the slim chance of boosting your ego. That's exactly what I did. I didn't expect anything to come of it. Guys like that usually match, send one half-hearted hey, and then disappear into the abyss. But this time, I got a message almost immediately. Not just any message, either. It was charming. Confident. He asked me how my day was going, cracked a joke about how he was terrible at small talk, and then said, "You seem fun. Coffee tomorrow." Coffee tomorrow. From a guy who looked like that. I was in shock, but somehow managed to play it cool. I agreed, and just like that, we had plans. The next morning, I was already mentally rehearsing my responses to anything he might say. Would I play it mysterious? Friendly? Should I casually bring up a hobby to seem interesting, or let him lead? While I was mid-freakout, I got a text from him. "Hey, slight issue. Can you pick me up? My car's in the shop." Now, I'll admit, that gave me pause. It wasn't a deal breaker, but it was unexpected. Still, he was hot, charming, and I was already looking forward to meeting him, so I thought, what's the worst that could happen? I texted back, "Sure, no problem," and grabbed my keys. When I pulled up to his place, he was waiting outside. And let me tell you, the pictures hadn't lied, he was gorgeous. I mean, this guy could have been cast in a romantic comedy, and no one would have questioned it. He slid into the passenger seat with an easy grin, complimented my car, and asked if I was more of a coffee or dinner person. When I said I hadn't eaten yet, he suggested grabbing some food instead of just coffee. Seemed reasonable. I nodded, and we headed to this little diner he swore had the best burgers in town. Dinner started off great. He was as funny and charming in person as he'd been over text. He told me about his job, cracked jokes about how bad he was at keeping plants alive, and somehow even made a story about spilling hot sauce on his boss sound hilarious. I was having fun. He was good company. After dinner, neither of us seemed ready to call it a night, so we decided to hang out a little longer. That's when things started to shift. We were parked at a scenic overlook, the kind of place that screams perfect first date vibes. I was expecting more light conversation, maybe even a flirtatious moment or two. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and sighed deeply. "I need to tell you something," he said, his tone suddenly serious. I blinked, unsure of where this was going. Okay. I have a son, he said. He's amazing. The best thing that ever happened to me. But I haven't seen him in months. Now, this wasn't necessarily a red flag. People have kids. Life happens. But the way he said it, with this heavy mix of sadness and desperation, made me realize this wasn't just a casual mention. It was about to be a thing. He went on to explain how his ex, his son's mom, had moved to Washington with the kid, completely cutting him off. I don't even know what part of Washington she's in, he said, shaking his head. I've tried everything, calling, messaging, even showing up at her mom's house, but nothing. It's been months. I don't even know what he looks like anymore. I didn't know what to say. This wasn't exactly what I'd expected to talk about on a first date, but I felt bad for him. That sounds really hard, I said, trying to sound sympathetic. I'm sorry you're going through that. He nodded, clearly appreciative of my response, and then said, I want to show you something. Before I could respond, he unlocked his phone, opened a folder, and handed it to me. These are all the pictures and videos I have of him, he said. Go ahead, scroll through. I looked at the screen, expecting a few cute baby pictures or maybe a funny video. But no, this was a full-blown archive. Hundreds of photos and videos meticulously organized and time-stamped. It was like a digital scrapbook dedicated solely to his son. I scrolled through the first few pictures, nodding and smiling politely. He's adorable, I said, hoping that would be enough to satisfy him. It wasn't. Wait, no, you have to see this one, he said, leaning over to swipe through the folder. This was his first Halloween. Isn't he the cutest pumpkin you've ever seen? I agreed, because what else was I supposed to do? But he wasn't done. For every single photo, he had a story. This was his first birthday. This was the day he learned to walk. This was the time he ate spaghetti and ended up with sauce all over his face. I lost track of how many pictures I scrolled through, but it felt endless. By the time I hit the halfway point, I realized there was no way out. He was going to make me look at every single one. To make matters worse, he wasn't just showing me pictures, he was reliving the memories in real time. Oh, this video is hilarious, he said, hitting play on a clip of his son giggling at a dog. You have to hear his laugh. Isn't that the cutest sound you've ever heard? I nodded, my face starting to ache from forcing a smile. Internally, I was screaming. I felt trapped, like I'd accidentally wandered into someone's private therapy session. I kept glancing at the clock, hoping he'd notice and realize this wasn't exactly first date material, but he was completely oblivious. Finally, we made it to the last photo. I handed him back his phone, thinking the ordeal was over. But then he looked at me, his eyes shining with what I can only describe as hope, and said, So, what do you think? What did I think? What could I possibly say? He's adorable, I repeated, which seemed to satisfy him. But inside, I was dying to escape. I felt bad for him. Clearly, he was dealing with a lot. But this was way too much, way too soon. The ride back to his place was quiet, mostly because I didn't trust myself to say anything that wouldn't come out wrong. When I dropped him off, he thanked me for listening, gave me a hug, and said, I hope we can do this again sometime. I drove home in stunned silence, replaying the night in my head. It wasn't just that he'd overshared, it was the sheer intensity of it all. The whole evening had gone from fun and flirty to emotionally exhausting in the span of an hour. This is the story of how one questionable Tinder match went from quirky to absolutely unhinged in the span of a single night. Buckle up, because this is a ride you don't want to miss. So the setup, I needed a date for a Passover dinner my friends were hosting. Not in a romantic, this could be the one kind of way, but more of a hey, it'll be fun to bring someone along, so I'm not the only single person at the table situation. Enter him. Let's call him Sam. Sam was intriguing on Tinder. His profile was a mix of slightly awkward selfies and a bio that screamed offbeat intellectual, complete with a quote from some obscure 19th century poet I had to Google. But he seemed harmless, and he had this dry humor that made me think, okay, why not? After a couple of decent conversations, I figured he'd be a good choice for a low-pressure dinner. Spoiler alert, I was very, very wrong. The moment he showed up, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. He arrived wearing a vest, like a full-on, old-timey vest, and a newsboy hat, the kind of ensemble you'd see in a high school production of Newsies. Not only that, but he introduced himself with a bow and a flourish of the hat, like we were in the middle of a 1920s speakeasy. My friends, bless them, tried not to laugh, but I could see their barely concealed smirks as I ushered him inside. Things went downhill quickly. The dinner table was set, the candles were lit, and everyone was settling in for what should have been a warm, celebratory evening. But Sam apparently had other plans. First, he refused to eat any of the food. Not because of dietary restrictions, not because of allergies, but because, and I quote, "things on the plate are touching." Now keep in mind, the first course was soup. Soup. How does one even process the idea that soup has things touching on the plate? I could see my friends exchanging bewildered glances, and all I could do was mouth, "I'm sorry," while internally screaming. If the food issue wasn't bad enough, he also wouldn't shut up during the Seder. You know, the 12 minutes where everyone reads the prayers, shares stories, and reflects on the meaning of the holiday? Yeah, Sam decided that was the perfect time to start making random comments about how he didn't believe in organized religion, but thought matzah was pretty cool. The awkward tension at the table was so thick you could have spread it on a cracker. I kept praying for the ground to swallow me whole. Then came the train debacle. The plan was simple. Sam was supposed to catch the last train back to his place. Easy, right? Wrong. He purposely missed it. I couldn't believe it when he casually said, "Oh, I guess I'll have to crash here tonight." No, absolutely not. That wasn't happening. There was no way I was letting this guy stay in my apartment, not after the disaster of dinner. I racked my brain for a way out, and finally came up with the excuse that I needed to take a friend home. My saint of a friend immediately caught on and agreed to play along, joining me in driving Sam to the nearest train station. Crisis averted, or so I thought. On the drive, things took a sharp turn from awkward to outright horrifying. Out of nowhere, Sam decided that the back seat of my car was the perfect place to unload some personal confessions. First, he told me he was schizophrenic. Now, I'm not one to judge anyone's mental health struggles. Everyone has their own battles. But he quickly followed that up by saying he didn't take medication because it's the devil. I froze, unsure of how to respond, while my friend stared straight ahead, gripping the dashboard like we were in the middle of a high-speed chase. But it didn't stop there. As if things couldn't get any worse, Sam reached over and tried to hold my hand. "Your hands are so small," he said in this weirdly soft voice. "They make me feel like a pedophile." I yanked my hand away so fast I probably pulled a muscle. My friend, meanwhile, was trying so hard not to laugh that she was shaking. I gave her a look that screamed, "Help me," but what could she do? We were trapped in the car with him until we reached the station. Then came the final nail in the coffin. As we neared the station, Sam suddenly announced, "I'm going to shit on the subway and write your name in it." He said it so casually, like he was commenting on the weather. I stared at him, completely stunned, while my friend muttered under her breath, "What the actual hell?" The second we pulled up to the station, I practically threw the car into park. "Well, here we are," I said, my voice way too chipper, as if that would somehow make the situation less insane. Sam climbed out, tipped his newsboy hat one last time, and walked off into the night like some deranged Dickensian character. Needless to say, there was no second date. On the drive home, my friend and I alternated between horrified silence and fits of uncontrollable laughter. "What just happened?" she kept asking, and honestly, I didn't have an answer. It was like I'd been trapped in a fever dream that somehow involved soup, hoverbob, and subway graffiti. I've had some weird Tinder dates in my time, but this one takes the cake, or should I say the matzah. It all started with a match on Tinder, as these things usually do. She had this sweet smile in her pictures, like the kind of girl you'd want to take home to meet your mom, if things got to that point. Her bio was simple, nothing flashy, lover of books, dogs, and trying new things. Let's see where this goes. It was basic, sure, but in a charming way that made her feel approachable. So I swiped right. Why not, right? To my surprise, we matched, and she messaged me first. That was rare. I was impressed by her confidence, and she kept the conversation light and fun. She asked about my favorite books, whether I had any pets, and threw in a joke about how she hoped I didn't own birds because they're just flying nightmares. I didn't, but the fact that she had such a strong stance on birds made me laugh. She seemed quirky in a way that felt endearing, not over the top. After a few days of texting back and forth, we decided to meet up. She suggested coffee, which was perfect, a classic first date setting, low stakes but with just enough ambience to keep things comfortable. The date was set, and I was looking forward to it. She seemed nice, and honestly, how often do you get to meet someone who doesn't immediately make you cringe when they type LOL? The day of the date arrived, and I was in a good mood. I got to the coffee shop a little early, and grabbed a table near the window, figuring it would make for a good spot to people watch if the conversation lulled. She texted to let me know she was on her way, and as I waited, I couldn't help but feel that mix of excitement and nerves that always comes with meeting someone new. When she walked in, I recognized her instantly. She looked just like her pictures, which was already a win in the world of online dating. She spotted me, waved, and came over with this big, excited smile. "Hey," she said, sitting down across from me. "So good to finally meet you." We dove into the usual first date small talk, and for the most part, it was going well. She told me about her dog, a golden retriever named Max, who apparently had a habit of stealing socks and hiding them in her bed. I told her about the time I accidentally adopted a cat because it followed me home from a party. We laughed, and the vibe was comfortable, almost too comfortable, honestly. She was acting like we were already good friends, which felt a little strange, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was just naturally outgoing. Then she dropped the first bombshell. "So my family is really excited to meet you," she said, casually sipping her latte. I blinked, sure I must have misheard her. "Wait, what?" "My family," she repeated, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "I've told them all about you. My mom actually said you sound like a great guy. She can't wait to meet you." At this point, I wasn't sure whether to laugh or run. I'd known this girl for, a week? We were barely 15 minutes into our first date, and she was already talking about her mom like we were planning a wedding. Trying to keep things light, I said, "Oh wow. That's flattering, I guess?" She smiled, completely oblivious to the panic creeping into my voice. "Yeah, and my dad's really into cars, so I told him about that project car you're working on. He thinks it's cool. Maybe you guys can talk about it when you come over." Now I was panicking. I glanced at my watch, trying to figure out how much longer I could reasonably stay before faking an emergency. "When I come over?" I repeated, hoping she'd clarify that this was all just some elaborate joke. "Yeah," she said, her eyes lighting up. "I thought we could swing by after this. They're having a little barbecue, and it'd be the perfect chance for you to meet everyone." I stared at her, trying to wrap my head around what was happening. This wasn't just enthusiasm. This was next level, meet the parents on the first date energy. I didn't even know her middle name, and she wanted me to meet her entire family? The worst part was that she wasn't even joking. She genuinely thought this was a good idea. I tried to play it cool. "That's really sweet of you," I said, my brain scrambling for a way out. "But I don't know if I'm ready for all that. I mean, we just met." Her smile faltered for the first time, and she tilted her head like I'd just told her I didn't believe in gravity. "What do you mean?" she asked. "You're great, and I think my family's really going to like you. It's not a big deal. Just come by for a little while." It was a big deal. It was the biggest deal. But I didn't want to be rude, so I mumbled something about needing to check on a friend later and tried to steer the conversation back to safer territory. She seemed a little disappointed, but she let it go for about 5 minutes. "So, what kind of wine do you like?" she asked, seemingly out of nowhere. I don't know. Red, I guess?" I said, confused. "Perfect," she said, clapping her hands together. "I'll text my mom to make sure she has some good reds for tonight. She loves hosting, and she's going to be so excited to meet you." And we were back to the family barbecue. I could feel my patience wearing thin, but I didn't want to blow up on her. Maybe this was just her way of showing she was excited. Maybe she was just nervous and overcompensating. I decided to give her one more chance to dial it back. "Look," I said gently, "you seem really great, but I think we're moving a little fast here. Let's just focus on getting to know each other first, okay?" Her face fell, and for a second, I thought she was going to cry. "I just thought you'd want to meet the people who are important to me," she said, her voice soft. "I really like you, and I've never felt this comfortable with someone before. Now I felt like the world's biggest jerk." She was laying it on thick, sure, but she was also being honest. I didn't want to hurt her feelings, so I nodded and said, "I appreciate that." "Really? But I think it's just a little too soon for me. Let's take things one step at a time." She smiled again, though it looked a little forced this time, and we finished our coffee in awkward silence. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. When we said goodbye, she gave me a hug that lasted a little too long and whispered, "Think about it, okay? My family's going to love you." As I walked back to my car, I kept replaying the conversation in my head, wondering how I could have missed the red flags. She'd seemed so normal at first, but now I wasn't sure if she was overly enthusiastic or just completely unhinged. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. There was not going to be a second date. She texted me later that night to ask if I'd changed my mind about the barbecue. I didn't have the heart to respond, so I just left her on read. The next morning, she sent another message, no hard feelings. Let me know if you change your mind. I didn't. Now, every time I tell this story, people ask me why I didn't just meet her family for the hell of it. It could have been funny, they say. Imagine the stories you'd have. And yeah, maybe they're right. But at the time, all I could think about was how fast she'd gone from being a potential match to planning my introduction to her parents. It was too much, too soon, and I wasn't about to stick around to see how much weirder it could get. Thanks, Tinder, for yet another unforgettable story, and a reminder to always swipe with caution.